where they don't correspond strongly with the agroecology literature, it's often, in several cases, it's that they're shining a light on some place where agroecologists should start paying attention, right? Like agroecosystem design, right? And design questions, and not just how we select land uses or select components of our system, but how we arrange them. That makes a tremendous difference for a whole bunch of functions. That just doesn't show up in the agroecology literature, and so that's one of the sort of lowest hanging fruit in terms of our capacity to say that some institutional science is already happening. Hey, check this out. There's all kinds of evidence that supports that this is important, and no research about it. So let's look at it. And there's a whole other set of areas where the contribution of permaculture to that literature is either a distinctive sort of integration of multiple concerns, or like a distinctively sort of aggressive emphasis on a few different things. Like in the agroecology literature, there is a literature on earthworks for water management, and there's plenty of literature on perennials. But in the permaculture literature, there's this distinctive integration of all these things into a sort of coherent framework, and this aggressive emphasis on the importance of having systematic integrated water management through your whole agroecosystem, right? Through interlinked earthworks. There's a really distinctive emphasis on what a key strategy increasing the perennial production within the agroecosystem. And likewise on polycultures, in the same way that perennials are emphasized. The way that we pay attention to polycultures and the assembly, design, and use of polycultures is distinct. It stands out. And it was suggested to me that I share this piece by Eric, and I would not want to normally punish the translator in this way, but since he's translating right now, that's what he gets.
Polycultivos perennes. That's how you say it.
This was a sort of in the conclusion of that paper, in which I wanted to try and just do some concluding, doing some summing up. And it's funny because this maybe not interesting part, but in a lot of journal papers, the conclusion is very much a throwaway part. But that also means it's a place where you can get some things that you can have more latitude to say some things that might be otherwise a little bit trickier to get into peer review. And so this isn't necessarily really controversial, but I was trying to say to the agroecology community, if permaculture has a sort of a hypothesis that it's testing, right? From the perspective of agroecology, it looks like the idea that if we systematically design agroecosystems, right, including questions of configuration, of like spatial arrangement, so with systematic design, where we're aggressively emphasizing diversity at multiple scales, sort of from the patch all the way to the field, all the way to the whole agroecosystem, and integrated water management, and access to global germplasm, right? So access to the global species bank, that we can increase the incredible productivity that agroecology has already shown happens in traditional land management systems. We're saying that we can take the traditional land management as a baseline, and by applying and integrating these tools, we can increase that productivity, especially labor productivity. And while retaining the things that have already been shown to be extremely valuable about all these traditional systems, including like sustainability and multifunctionality. Any questions so far? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
All right.
What's the definition of systems? Traditional systems. What's traditional?
Sorry,
what's that
question?
What's traditional systems?
There's a lot of different ways to define that, and it's not a key part of the paper, and so I'm like, that's not conventional, so not like the last 100 years of green revolution and stuff, but land use systems that have a few centuries of tenure, I would say, qualify as traditional. So that was the good news. And then the sort of, what I have labeled in my notes is the We Got Issues section, is there's a few things that pop out from the literature. And one is that we have a tendency, or what we write has this tendency to take sort of ecological first principles and then extrapolate from them in a way that is really simplistic and oversimplifies, right? And to assume that this like really broad pattern of how ecosystems work, that we can take that and sort of we'll get exactly what we want to find, what we want to achieve by applying what seems like that principle in other environments, in our managed ecosystems. So a key example of this is the edge concept. And Mollison and Holmgren base their concept of the edge off of looking at the ecological characteristics of boundaries, of ecotones in natural ecosystems, and based on some conversations that Mollison had with some wheat researchers. And the fact that the boundaries between ecosystems are where there is a lot of production happening and a lot of biodiversity. That's true. That's still very well accepted science. But when we apply that in a way like where you see it's like, oh well, you're putting a garden bed, you should crenulate the edges of the bed, right? You should have lobes in the bed, and you'll get more productivity that way, right? Or if you're putting in a pond and you crenulate the edges of the pond, then you will be able to pull more food out of that pond, is the implication. And that is not at all always the case, and in many cases is the opposite, right? And including other factors like you may have more microbial diversity at the edges of that pond, which you've also, that won't necessarily translate into more harvestable biomass, and it will certainly increase your harvest labor exponentially. So, and there's people who are talking about the edge, effect and the edge principle in much more nuanced and sophisticated ways that are sort of grounded in a real hard empirical look at what works. And so whenever I'm talking about any of these issues, I'm never talking about the whole of the conversation that we're having. I'm never talking about all the literature, but just like this is a one stream or like one part of the legacy that we have. Another important one, maybe even more important in sort of the contemporary moment in permaculture, is the way that people talk about the relationship between net primary production, or like total photosynthesis, and food production, and the relationship between those two things. The justification for forest gardens in temperate climates is almost always based on the fact that temperate forests have among the highest net primary production of any ecosystem on the planet. Certainly any terrestrial ecosystem in particular. They're among the highest. And that perennial systems generally have higher net primary production than annual systems. And that's used to explain, to justify and sort of promote these systems. But in fact, perennial systems invest a much higher proportion of their photosynthesis into structure. And so they have a much slimmer margin that's available for export, as like in terms of harvestable product, right? A much slimmer margin of their total photosynthesis goes into things that we can harvest and eat. And so what that means is not that we can't feed ourselves through agroforestry systems. What it means is that NPP is not the same as food production. And the question of what kind of system is going to produce the most food in a given environment, or the question about the relationship between NPP and how much food we can take out of a system is actually a complicated one that we have to answer on a site-by-site basis with research, rather than with this simple, we've got an ecological principle, and so we know that we'll be able to get the most food out of any environment with perennial species. We have to actually show that, and the minor tragedy involved is that there's actually many justifications for for forest gardens, for example. They're extremely multifunctional. There's a lot there. We don't have to use this basically misleading relationship between NPP and food.
You're really going fast. This is great. Perennial systems invest much more of their photosynthesis in
structure.
Thanks.
And this stuff, what I'm talking about right here, is all in the paper. I'll get to, and shortly I'll get to stuff that is not in the paper.
Hey Rafter, what's NPP?
Net primary production, so it's total photosynthesis. Has anybody encountered that argument for forest gardens and for perennial systems? Few people. Okay. Another quick example is the way that we talk about diversity in systems. That by increasing diversity, we will always be increasing the functions that we need. Like we'll be increasing productivity, we'll be increasing resilience, we'll be deterring pests by making our planting sort of more diverse and maybe more complex, like more complicated. Packed in, and that's also just not the case. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. It works at the pattern level. Like if you look across many sites, there's a general trend where diversity increases, and you get again more net primary production, and sometimes more food. But there's also where that trend is going to level off, and where it might dip back down again because you've got so much diversity now. You are actually providing shelter for herbivorous pests that are going to eat your crop, right? Which has been demonstrated in some of the earliest forest garden research in the 80s in tropical systems, where they found that the forest garden mimic, or the natural forest mimic, actually had less of a harvest because they provided shelter and actually travel routes, little highways for the ants that wanted to eat the cassava. Right? So I just think the lesson is just like it ain't necessarily so. Right? It's just not that simple. What's that? It depends. Oh, it depends. Right? Yeah. So that's all in the container of we have a little weakness for extrapolating from ecological principles in a way that is overly simplistic. The other thing that we tend to do in the literature, and I'm going to keep using the first person because I feel like not necessarily the literature, but I've done these things too, right? Is that we underplay, we really underemphasize the complexity and risk involved in, especially for example, for producers, in trying to develop and manage a really diverse and integrated farming system. There's just a lot of complexity and risk involved, and there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. There's all the more elements you put together, not only are the more beneficial interactions, but the more interactions that you just didn't have any idea were going to happen. I like to propose the principle of expect a mess. And that works for social and ecological systems. And in some ways, for me, I feel like some of the sort of interventions or shifts that we can make in these ways of thinking are actually just to add on a little thing, like a principle of expect a mess. Because if we see the sort of broad trends in these relationships, or if we see like the truth in the ecological principles, and use that to inform and inspire our design, but we go into it knowing that it's not going to be neat and pretty, and that we're going to have to evolve that design iteratively over years, then we don't get disillusioned the first time we hit the ground, the first time we run into the wall, and we're sort of ready for it. And I think that's something that we all need to do as teachers and promoters, is really prepare our students and prepare our audience for to take these ideas into the world, to take them into practice, so that they. Thanks. wide open, yeah. Two more quick things. There's this, really, distinct kind of tone in the permaculture literature, tone and content that I started calling simple solutions populism. And that's the idea that, and that's not a dismissive label. That's just a label. It's something I see happening. Is that in confronting the sort of global crises that we are, that the ways that the tools that we have to respond to that, or the way that we need to respond to that, are with things that each of us can do ourselves, starting in our backyard. And this simple solutions populism, I feel, is a tremendous two-edged sword. Because on one hand, I actually think it's a huge, tremendous part of the reason why permaculture has spread in the way that it has spread, and why we're here today. Right? Because encountering that look at the world, that the solutions are in our grasp and we can start now and we don't have to wait for anybody else to change anything, is extremely empowering and draws people in and gives them hope and is engaging. And the other edge is that it threatens to depoliticize problems that are really fundamentally political. Right, and threatens to foster political naivete about the scale of action that's required, and the fact that depoliticize issues that are fundamentally political. Because if we think, Emily Kawano, brilliant solidarity economy activist, on encountering permaculture. And Emily Kawano, and she's a solidarity economy, Kawano, and I met her at the financial permaculture course last January, to my great enlightenment and delight, and on encountering permaculturists who were saying, well, all we have to do is build the new society, right? We don't have to get into that negativity of confronting the existing institutions. She was like, you guys have heard of that, like, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they then they fight you, then you win. She's like, you guys are still in the ignore you phase, just edging into laughing at them, right? They'll fight you. Like, you're not gonna get to where you need to get without confronting the institutions in the system that we live in.
Hearing about this research.
What's that?
Monsanto won't be happy about your research.
Monsanto, we're not at the point yet where Monsanto gives a crap about what we're doing. And so, a little bit of context for me is the department that I work in is 95% Monsanto research and another 4% BP biofuels research. So, I'm a nice shiny token in the new agroecology unit.
And your office is on Broom Club.
What's that?
Your office is on Broom Club.
It's actually like, no windows, but it's fairly roomy. And then along with sort of this simple solutions populism, which I think is sort of this two-edged sword that we need to grapple with, preferably by the handle. There's actually another strain of that we also have, which I call like anti-science populism, right? Which you don't have to like look too hard into Mollison's talks to find him saying, as recently, I think his Agro-Innovations interview from like 2007, very recently, him still saying everything that comes out of the universities is bullshit. And you can look at the history of soil erosion, and it increases at the same rate as soil scientists. Funny dude. Like, and when Mollison and Holmgren burnt their bridges with institutional science in 1978, or around then, they actually had pretty good reason to do so, because their claims that the institutions were fundamentally just hidebound, conservative, totally threatened by interdisciplinary thinking was right, as far as I can tell. But the terrain has changed since then, and there are now entire departments, entire disciplines we've got that emerged at the same time as permaculture, but took the other route of staying in the institutions and keeping home, fighting for access to those resources, and generating research, generating numbers, right? So agroecology, agroforestry, disciplines or sub-disciplines like ecological engineering, things like that. And so we need to respond to that change in the landscape. And the problem, thank you. So the problem with that anti-science populism and the legacy of it that we live with is that what it does is it drives our orientation towards charisma and celebrity as a source of credibility, right? If all the experts and all the institutions are just stupid, right, and wrong and greedy, then all that we have to look to are our celebrities, right? Our powerful speakers and internationally traveling superstars. And I love our superstars. I've got my Darren Doherty poster up. A few people here have one too. But it's not enough to get us where we need to go. So,
are you selling those Darren Doherty posters?
I'll make them available on my website. Give me a little time to some Photoshop. So I often describe my work as rebuilding bridges between permaculture and contemporary science, and it's doing a little bit of slipping in the idea that there have been bridges, and now we're just rebuilding them. But some people may dispute that. And so what's at stake in that is in that project is, one, that we're starved for feedback. Right? We need to improve our game. We need to improve our practice by systematic assessment of our impacts, and we can't do that without using the tools and the resources from scientific research, whether we're working with scientific institutions or not. Thing two is sort of our view from the margins. I think the perspective that we have to share is vital, and we need to expand our influence. And when I see the reports on from the special rapporteur on the right to food, Oliver Schutter, come out and see agroecology all through there, and see agroecology adopted by Via Campesina as their sort of scientific framework, and permaculture not getting mentioned anywhere in these, it just makes me realize, for me it's not a turf thing. I'm an agroecologist too, so I win either way, right? But it's that there's a contribution for permaculture to make to those discussions that's not getting made because we have stayed so marginal. And then the third piece is setting ourselves up as credible stewards so we can get access to resources. Right? We need to fund research. We need to fund projects, and so we need to do due diligence so that people can see that we are a good investment of resources. Right? And so that can look a few different ways. That can look like permaculture actually showing up in peer-reviewed research, permaculture getting mentioned in peer-reviewed research, there's another pathway is permaculturists just start paying attention to peer-reviewed research in some more systematic way, and thanks to the Research Digest that Permaculture UK has started in the last year, where they're just posting articles relevant to what we do, the different sectors of what we do. And it can also look like permaculturists conducting systematic research, whether or not it's peer-reviewed. right? We can be doing science, and we actually, in many cases, don't have to embed ourselves with scientific institutions, right? There's a lot of tools that we can use that don't require that embedded institutional relationship. That's one set of tools that's available to us, and we don't have to have it. Permaculturists can do research. A bit, yeah. How am I doing on time? When did I start? Quarter after?
What's the next track?
Okay. 18 minutes. Okay. So two kind of like transitional concepts that have been useful for me in thinking about like what is as I've sort of been like grappling with the idea of science for the permaculture movement. Some 2 points of inspiration for me have been one, looking at the incredible peer-reviewed literature on traditional ecological knowledge, which spans many disciplines. And one like sort of great introductory text is called Sacred Ecology by Ferguson. And any of these things, feel free to ask me about afterwards if you don't get it while I say it the first time. And one of the things that Burks identifies in that is this incredibly strong global pattern in land use strategies, right? That there's these patterns of land use in terms of home gardens, in terms of fisheries management, in terms of swidden agriculture and the uses of burning. These broad patterns happen again and again and again all over the world, and they're very strong, and they vary wildly in the details from watershed to watershed, right? So the pattern is very strong, and the technique is all over the place, and all these different cultures with these techniques use them to support themselves and reproduce their culture, right? So when we get dogmatic about a particular technique and the importance of a particular technique, especially across multiple sites and across multiple contexts, we can say, well, that might be sketchy. And so I want to sort of ask myself the question: does my teaching reflect this? When I teach and I talk about permaculture, do I talk about it in a way that conveys that grounding in traditional ecological knowledge, where I incorporate a sense of how widely sites and techniques vary in a fairly fine-grained way, as you know. Yeah. And I think of this as like, are we teaching one size fits all or one size fits most recipes, or are we teaching design, are we teaching the parameters that shape our design? And then the other sort of transitional piece is learning from the farmer-to-farmer agroecological movement here in Cuba and elsewhere in Latin America, and what they say is that technique is easy, right? Everybody's got some. They all work like somewhat. Right, and the technique is actually not the important part, right? The technique is a little bit of effort to figure out what the techniques, figure out what things to try in a particular site. The hard part, the niche, the unmet need, right, is the social process that facilitates the development and implementation of techniques that fit a particular site, right? And that's a page for us to take from the campesino agroecology movement throughout Latin America and India and in Africa, and now that it's been adopted by Via Campesina, really being very broadly established.
Can you give that sense again, social process?
A social process that facilitates the development and implementation of technique in any given site. And so again, I ask myself, does my teaching reflect that? Do the PDCs I teach reflect that? To a certain extent they do. But I think, and the whole question of like how variable is the PDC curriculum is maybe we don't have time to get into it.
Session.
We'll deal with that in the Q&A. So, just to return to the concept of people science and to kind of throw out a few like very draft principles of people science, right? Of people science for permaculture. Third time charm for this definition. So it is a culture of experimentation and critical thinking that incorporates the tools and resources of scientific research and scientific knowledge, and incorporates them and uses them in movements for the liberation of people and of our home, the earth. So, some principles. Principle 1, show your work. And what I mean by that is give the context of the ideas that you're talking about. Don't present ideas, even if you think the principle is universal. The origin of that principle and how it's talked about has a context, right? So talk about where your ideas come from. And the principles that I'm talking about here are largely for teachers and promoters, and hopefully we'll get to some a little bit talk about for practitioners also. So give the history of ideas whenever you can, and the source of ideas, and whenever possible, even give references. Give it a try. It can be really useful, and it won't clutter up your slide that much. You might even like it. Principle 2: develop a bullshit allergy. In order to do that in an effective way, we need to start distinguishing between claims based on people's experience and sweeping claims about what works everywhere. Right? And the difference between I did this and this is what happened and I'm telling you about it, and whenever anybody does this, this is what happens. Right? And we need to question sweeping claims of that latter variety from wherever they come from, whether it's peer-reviewed science or Monsanto or permaculturists. And the kind of the pair that goes with that is develop skeptical humility, in particular towards experiential claims. And this is, for me, is a lesson from like farmer first research and traditional ecological knowledge, is that when someone is telling you about their experience, about what they did and how it worked, that you can just accept what they're saying with humility and suspend belief or disbelief, and just know that this is what happened for this person, right? That's one data point, that's one piece of knowledge that over time we can integrate with others and get a bigger picture, right? So we don't need to call bullshit on people because they do something that we don't think should work, and we also don't need to uncritically accept what somebody tells us as, oh well, this is the new jam right here. This is how we should all do it. Another principle of teach the dynamics. So instead of when we're sort of trying to pay attention to, like, we've got those patterns of land use and we've got lots of details of technique at particular sites, we can teach we can still teach big picture by teaching the processes that drive those similarities, and we can teach the processes that drive those differences across sites. Right? We can teach about climate systematically without and still acknowledge that there's going to be lots of very small scale variation in climate based on topography and microclimate effects and all that stuff. And so teaching the underlying processes and not only the pattern, because the pattern always breaks down the further you zoom in. And a sort of companion to that is teach the controversy. Right? Don't teach anything as received wisdom if you can help it. Because the controversy is actually, it's for me the most interesting thing about the topic is what are the points of contention and disagreement, right? And we can't gloss those over. And for another thing, that's what actually equips your students to take those ideas into the world, right? Because we've all been aware, I imagine, of the phenomenon of like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students fresh out of a PDC, like going out into the world, like, and telling farmers they're stupid, or doing like telling researchers why don't they just do the thing that everybody knows actually works all the time when you do it. It's just like all the ways that you can just put your foot in your mouth and make permaculture look like some gonzo cult is happening fairly regularly, right? So prepare your students for that, and so I'm saying this to me too. I want to prepare my students for that by teaching the controversy and the disagreement. So science has this dual nature, right? And we need to face like very fully look at and understand that dual nature, where on one hand, it actually enlightens us about shit that's going on in the world and how the world works, right? We learn important things from that process that we maybe wouldn't be able to learn otherwise. And two, it always emerges from a political and social context, right? So both of those things are true all the time with science, right? So we need to not put peer review on some kind of pedestal where that's what decides what's true. And this is what lots of sort of internal and external critics of permaculture like to do, is to act like scientific institutions are some unstoppable truth factory. We know that's not true. And so we need to neither put science on a pedestal nor reject it outright. We need to sort of hold on to that sense of the dual nature and all the contradictions there. And so we need to be ready to ask, when a claim is made, how do we know? Like, how do we know? What the thing you're telling me, how do we know that's true? Right? What is the evidence for that? What else could have caused that effect? Right? You saw some change, you saw something happening, and you have an idea about what did it. What else might have done it? To ask that about our systems. To ask, what more do we need to know in order to actually act on this knowledge? Right? And it might be about something that's actually not right in the same container as what we've been researching about. We need to actually move from something that we know in a field plot to learning about the social context or the political context. And some great sort of case studies in this are looking at sort of key line design and rotational grazing. Rotational grazing has, believe it or not, its effects have never been confirmed in any kind of peer-reviewed research, and it's been researched, right? And they've never shown the effects that we take for granted. And there's a lot of reasons for this. There's a lot of discussion about this and about why that is, and how setting up controlled experimental plots to test rotational grazing basically eliminates the idea of adaptively managing the way that farmers actually do. And so you wouldn't expect it to show those effects. But it sort of points us towards the principle of, and this is something also I take from agroecology, is that if a lot of farmers are doing it, you should pay attention. Right? If a lot of farmers are doing it and they're finding it to be effective, even for those of us who are more working in scientific institutions, you don't dismiss it based on the lack of peer review. You just pay more attention and keep digging, right? And then for key line design, there's just never been any research about it at all. Amazed, shockingly, right? There's never been any, as far as I know, except there's projects emerging. There was just a study, actually, they just published sort of informal results on a hillside in Vermont, where they did side-by-side key line and non-key line and showed no effect from key lining. And it was also in soil that was already extremely fertile in a humid environment, right? So, there's that. And just in the interest of showing my work, this sort of face the dual nature of science is really drawn from an article from a great mathematical ecologist and friend to permaculture and to the people named Richard Levins. He's got an article called 10 Propositions on Science and Anti-Science. And any reference that you want from me at the end, I'd be happy to share. Couple more. Say heck no to techno fixes. A techno fix is when people propose a technical solution, a technique that's actually going to solve extremely complex problems, and tends to ignore all the social and political requirements of a given technique, of a given technical solution to be scaled up. What's that? Yeah, and often biological as well. And so for me, like, the sort of principle of unintended consequences plays into this, and certainly about the broad-scale implementation of biochar that we hear being proposed. I feel that the principle of unintended consequences is sort of looming over that discussion. And in terms of the social piece, assume every proposal has winners and losers, right? And think about who are the winners and losers for this technical proposal that is offering a purely sort of biophysical response that's gonna, or even sometimes it might have a social element, but it's a technical rather than a technical, like top-down managerial solution. And then as presenters, we can, I guess the principle is don't mystify, right? So use jargon sparingly and critically and appropriately, and be mindful of the temptation to make things sound sciencey. And not only don't fool people by dressing up I want to not fool people by dressing up my presentations with needless jargon, and I bet you're already thinking, he does that though. I see that tendency to use, to get excited about words.
You're not perfect?
It's, well, I didn't say that. So I want to be reflective about that, and think about how I'm using language. And also, and this is sort of like about not mystifying yourself, but it actually really deserves its own principle, which is value the evidence that you encounter that refutes your theories, as well as the evidence that confirms them. And this is like, this idea prompts a lot of reflection on my part about how much I do this in just freaking day-to-day life, right? Just in like arguing with my partner, and like much less in like trying to make a career. And then the last of these is when we think about how this integrates with our work of like getting out there in the world and trying to share this sort of like the core concept of the core like worldview of permaculture, that we can meet our needs while increasing ecosystem health, right? And getting people engaged and inspired. We want to go out there with like an exciting narrative and a charismatic narrative. And how do we balance that? And just to know that actually that can be balanced, and that you can include open questions and challenges and controversies along with the potential, and that the tension between those things can actually be something that drives your presentation, right? That drives your public work. And I would propose that they're never irreconcilable, right? We can always include the questions along with the incredible potential. And from my experience in teaching, that has actually made me and my students more interested in what we're doing when I'm able to do that. And so, like, an example of that is, or moving towards an example of that is the concept, like the urgency of implementation, the urgency with which we approach getting things out there and getting things in the ground is not only so that we can just fix problems, but it's so that in doing that we can learn how to fix problems. Right? Because every time we do that, it's another opportunity to watch something work or not work. And so we can look at that urgency as not only about we have the solution, but also we are moving towards the solution and learning as we go, because that's the only way to do it. Time, okay. Well, I'll move to questions. Don't apply it on everything at once. right? Because then, if whatever happens, you don't know what caused it, right? So you have nothing to compare it with. So if you want to examine something that's like change over time, then you need to establish baseline data, right? And this would be amazing if in every PDC we taught, like, one of the first things that you do when you get on a new site is gather baseline data. What's that? A picture is a version of that. Yeah. And journaling. Yeah.
Soil carbon, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean anything from a picture and journaling up to like soil organic matter, and you know, there's no end of stuff. And it's not just field-based either, but like, you know, these things all apply to urban environments and to architecture and to, you know, all kinds of other stuff. And then, so baseline data, if you want to do what's called a time series study, if you want to study change over time. If you want to do, like, really test a particular technique and compare it, you know, have a control, have something that you don't apply that technique to. Right, so you can either do this in space or time, where you get data on what happens if you hadn't done anything, and then as you get up to more complex questions, you get to the point where we need to start sharing questions between sites, right? So we can look at what's happening on multiple sites, and that gets to the second second principle is partnerships, right? There's no way to do any of the things that we need to do on one site alone. And so we can have partnerships between multiple sites. We can have partnerships between those sites and institutions that just help facilitate that process, like regional and local permaculture organizations that just help do the assessment and facilitation and coordination of figuring out what are the problems that we want to all ask together collectively and see what happens on our sites. And then on a sort of layer around that is like we can actually make those partnerships with scientists and scientific institutions.
Hi. Brilliant, Rafter. Thank you. This is so helpful. You know, what it's making me think of is, what if we had some kind of institution of our own that actually could develop its own credibility, get its own funding, that had as its core ethics, it doesn't take money from corporations that are involved in things like research, and that could provide another educational kind of locus for a lot of students who want to do this kind of stuff and either can't handle the university or in the U.S. now can't afford the university. One of the things I often tell people is take a permaculture design course. You could spend $1,500 or $2,000, even if you pay full price, and get yourself set for something that will actually give you a real career, where you can spend $50,000 in the university and end up, you know, waiting tables somewhere. You know, so and I think there could be potential to do alternative things like even like crowdfunding.
That's my research is crowdfunded.
Really?
Also, by the way, yeah.
So I don't know if people are interested in thinking about that. Maybe there's some way to connect together and continue talking about it.
We actually, this conversation to continue. I want to break it up now, just because we're at time, and I don't want to take up other folks' space and time. But this conversation is continuing in space 5 and again tomorrow afternoon. So thanks, everybody.